Tonight, we're heading straight into the dust and danger of the Old West. No slow-motion duels or spotless saloons here. This is where revolvers jammed, ghost stories echoed through the sagebrush, and men placed their faith in horses, luck, and whatever charm they had stitched into their hatbands. We'll ride through shootouts that were more bark than bullet, campfire tales that still raise neck hairs, brutal trails that broke more than just boots, and the surprising bond between cowboys and their animals, loyal to the last mile. If you believed the dime novels, cowboys shot from the hip, never missed, and settled every argument in 6 seconds flat. Reality, a little sweatier, a lot messier, guns jammed, tempers flared. And the fast draw? That was mostly for the crowds. The real West didn't move in slow motion. It moved in mistakes, in drunk misunderstandings, and in cold steel flashing too close to the gut. The revolver was flashy. Sure, 6 bullets. Big noise. But half the folks carrying one didn't even know how to aim it. A lot of them never fired in anger. They just wore it, like a warning sign hanging from their belt. But the knife? That was the real deal. Hidden in boots, tucked into vests, slipped down a sleeve. Quick, silent, intimate. It wasn't about bravado. It was about surviving the alley behind the saloon when nobody was watching. Duels were different, public, almost performative. 2 men would square off at high noon, if they had any sense of timing, or just when the tension boiled too hot. People gathered not to help but to watch. A duel wasn't always to the death. Sometimes it ended with one man's pride bleeding into the dirt and the other walking away with a reputation 2 sizes too big. A quick trigger didn't make you famous. Surviving a duel and looking good doing it, that's what stuck. Of course, there were rules. Sort of. Some towns tried to ban firearms. Didn't work. Others tried to referee duels. Hopeless. The West was too big for rules. But it did have stories. The kind that spread like wildfire. A kid would see 2 men face off in a dust-blown street and, years later, tell it like it was myth. He didn't even blink, they'd say. Dropped him in 1 shot. No one mentioned the missed shots, the trembling hands, the crowd gasping more than the gunman. And then there was the myth of the quick draw. Oh, people loved that one. A man standing perfectly still, waiting for a twitch, then, bam! Gun out, bullet flying, the other guy still reaching for his holster. But most fights didn't work like that. Drawing a gun under pressure is hard. You drop it. You fumble the hammer. You forget to cock it back. And if the other guy's already mad enough to swing, you're toast before your fingers even brush the grip. That's why so many old-timers stuck to knives or fists. No misfires. No nerves. Just grit and reflex. Still, some men practiced. A lot. Drilled their draw like it was a holy ritual. Some got good, scary good. They'd hang cans from fence posts and split them before you even heard the click. But that didn't make them brave. It just made them rehearsed. Half of them never pulled the trigger in a real fight. The other half, they were dead before they had a chance. Thing is, no one wanted to fight. Not really. Not unless they were stupid or drunk or both. Fights meant scars. Fights meant the sheriff showing up. Fights meant someone didn't walk home. So most cowboys talked tough, made noise, and hoped it never came to more than a shove. And when it did come to blood, it happened fast. No music, no stare down, just a shout, a flash, and someone gasping in the dust. Funny how much of it was about pride. You could insult a man's horse, his boots, even his hat, but question his nerve and suddenly the table got flipped. Because out there, your name was your currency. If folks thought you were scared, it stuck like burrs on a trail blanket. And nothing tore that off like winning a fight. Clean, fast, and in front of witnesses. That's why some cowboys staged their own duels. Picked a time, chose an audience, wore their cleanest shirt. They didn't want blood, they wanted a legend. A little gunpowder, a lot of theater. And when no one died, well, that just made the story easier to retell. Truth was, the West wasn't full of killers. It was full of storytellers. And every blade, every bullet, every dusty standoff, just more fuel for the fire. Some towns tried to clean up. They'd put up big hand-painted signs. No firearms in city limits. Nice idea. Didn't stop anyone. A man might hand over his pistol at the edge of town, sure, but odds were good he had a second one hidden in his saddlebag, or his boot, or behind the bar in case someone got twitchy. Guns weren't just protection. They were props, part of the costume of being a man in the West. Even bartenders carried, tucked under the counter, half-rusted but loaded. Because trouble didn't knock, it staggered in, loud and loudmouthed, usually around midnight, smelling like whiskey and sweat. And when it did, you didn't have time to ask questions. You ducked, you reached, you hoped your hand was faster than theirs. Not that every bar was a battlefield. Some were downright quiet. Cards, cheap piano music, the gentle clink of glass. But all it took was one bad hand, one sore loser, and then chairs flew, fists followed, and someone went for steel. Usually a knife. Guns made noise and headlines. Knives made corpses disappear quietly into the alley. There was a kind of etiquette to violence. Unspoken but understood. You didn't shoot a man in the back unless you were really mad or really scared. You didn't pull a weapon unless you meant to use it. And if someone called you out in the middle of the street, you had two choices: face him or vanish before sunrise. Pride decided most of it, and pride was a terrible strategist. Sometimes the deadliest men were the quietest. Not the loudmouths who bragged about how many bullets they'd fired, but the ones who kept their hands close and their eyes half-lidded. They didn't boast. They didn't blink. They just watched, waited, measured people like tailors sizing up a coat. You'd never see them coming. You'd just feel the sharp end of a lesson you didn't want to learn. There were towns with legends. Tombstone, Deadwood, Dodge, each with their own stories, some true, some borrowed, some completely made up over whiskey. Men who could split a playing card at 10 paces. Others who shot 5 men before breakfast. But dig a little deeper, and most of those tales came from the same 3 drunks who repeated them every payday. Truth had a way of shrinking under scrutiny. Still, you couldn't deny the danger. It was real. Some poor kid from Kansas would ride west hoping to herd cattle and end up 6 feet under because he looked at the wrong man sideways. Violence didn't need a reason, just a spark, a mood, a little too much heat in the air. And once it started, it didn't stop until something bled. That's why most cowboys kept to themselves. They drank quietly, stayed in the corner, never started trouble, but always knew where their gun was, or their knife, or their friend who was quicker than they were. It wasn't about winning. It was about walking out the front door in one piece. Because in the West, survival was the only real fame that mattered. You could always tell when a fight was about to happen. The way the room shifted. It wasn't loud, not at first. Laughter thinned out. The cards got slapped down a little softer. And somewhere in the corner, a stool creaked just a bit too sharply. Cowboys knew the signs. They'd been around enough to feel the air tighten, to hear the breath that didn't get taken. Out on the frontier, a sixth sense was often more useful than a sixth shot. The tension usually started with nothing. A spilled drink, a crooked glance, a hand that lingered too long near a pistol grip. A man might say, "Watch it," or "You best walk away." But he didn't mean either. What he meant was, "I need to be seen," because reputation was worth more than gold in those towns. It could get you credit at the general store, a room without a deposit, and a card seat without question. But a single show of fear, that could cost you everything. The idea of honor loomed large, bigger than laws, bigger than bullets. That's why so many fights started over something as stupid as a card game or a crooked smile. It wasn't really about winning money or defending your hat. It was about not being the one who backed down. Some men built their whole identities around that. Their hands were quick because their pride was quicker. Once the shouting started, things escalated fast. Words turned into shoves, shoves into broken bottles, and soon someone was bleeding. Most often, it wasn't even a gun that did it. It was a knife or a chair leg or the thick bottom edge of a whiskey glass. Guns were loud and messy. Knives were quieter, more final. The saloon crowd rarely intervened. There was no such thing as breaking up a fight. You just stood back, let it burn out, and hoped the blood didn't reach your boots. And then came the silence, that heavy, bitter stillness. Someone might mutter something about how it didn't have to end that way, but no one meant it. It always ended that way. One man gasping, another shaking, both of them covered in someone else's story. If the sheriff showed up, he'd ask a few questions, then ask who started it. And if there were no witnesses willing to talk, which there usually weren't, he'd shrug, haul the body out, and tell the undertaker to keep it simple. Most towns didn't have proper jails. Justice came quick or not at all. Frontier law ran on convenience and consensus. If folks agreed you were trouble, you might find yourself run out by nightfall or hanged by morning. But if they liked you, if you bought drinks and tipped the piano player, well, maybe they forgot what they saw. Memory was elastic out there. Truth bent like heat over a desert trail. Men carried their weapons as much for theater as for threat. It wasn't always about killing. Sometimes it was about looking like you could. The tilt of a holster, the way a coat opened just enough to show the metal. All part of the dance. A cowboy might spend hours in front of a mirror perfecting his draw, but never fire a shot in anger his whole life. Yet his reputation would grow with every tale told about the time he almost pulled on someone. Some wrote down their fights in little journals. Others just told the stories over and over until fact blurred into legend. Names changed, details shifted, but the core of it stayed the same. Violence was a constant companion. Not because people loved it, but because they expected it. Like rain, like rust, like heartbreak. And through it all, the saloon doors kept swinging. The piano kept playing. The cards kept falling. Because the West didn't stop for grief, or fear, or justice. It just kept rolling, dusty and dangerous, full of men who learned to speak with their hands and listen with their eyes. By the time a man got to be known for his draw, he usually didn't need to prove it anymore. The stories did the work. Folks gave him space, sometimes a whole table to himself. Even if half the tales were baloney, they stuck harder than truth ever could. A whisper in the right saloon could make a drifter into a legend before sundown. What mattered wasn't whether he'd shot 10 men. It was that people thought he might. That flicker of doubt kept tempers in check, especially when whiskey started talking. Because everyone knew the West had no safety nets. No one was coming to break up your fistfight or drag you off to court. You were judge, jury, and sometimes the poor fool on the wrong end of it all. Still, most cowboys weren't murderers. They were tired, sunburned, broke. They had cattle to chase and fences to mend. A six-shooter was part of the uniform, not a statement. They didn't wake up looking for trouble, but they also didn't shy from it. If you backed down too many times, you'd find yourself pushed to the edge of town, or off your horse and out of a job. And so violence became a tool. Not the first tool, but always nearby, just in case a deal went sour or a boss decided not to pay. It wasn't about glory, it was about leverage. A revolver on your hip said, "I can't be pushed too far." A Bowie knife tucked in your boot said, "Go ahead, try." Guns themselves were temperamental things. They jammed. misfired, needed constant cleaning. The black powder left your hands smelling like burnt rope and sulfur. That didn't stop anyone from carrying, but it did mean they got real familiar with how things worked. Knowing how to fix a misfire in a sandstorm, that was a survival skill. The gunsmith was often the most respected man in town, just under the saloon keeper. In some dusty corners of the West, entire reputations balanced on what kind of weapon a man wore. Colts were flashy. Remingtons were steady. A man with a double action could pull and fire in one squeeze, but folks said it made you lazy. The real artists still used single-action revolvers. Slower, riskier, but somehow nobler, as if the extra step made the killing more honest. But weapons weren't just for men. Plenty of women learned to shoot, some out of necessity, others because they were tired of being cornered. A lady with a derringer in her garter could end an argument before it started. And she didn't need to be quick, just determined. Out there, nobody cared what you looked like if you could aim straight. Then there were the show-offs. The gun spinners, trick shooters, traveling performers who could hit a coin-tossed midair while blindfolded. Townsfolk ate it up. Kids clapped, grown men leaned in close. It all looked like fun. But even those entertainers had scars. They'd been in real trouble once, maybe twice. The stage was safer than the streets. You got to wear the legend without risking your skin. Every so often, a real showdown happened. Maybe at dawn, maybe just before supper. Two figures in the street, dust rising, spectators watching from windows. Nobody breathed. Hands hovered near holsters like flies near a carcass. And then bang. It was over in a blink. One man down, the other walking away slower than he needed to. Not because of guilt, because of theater. Afterwards, someone would write it up in a letter home. Someone else would draw a sketch. And before long, it'd be printed in a local paper, then copied in some Eastern magazine, exaggerated and polished into legend. By the time it reached New York, it wasn't two men fighting over a spilled beer. It was a war between titans. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing about weapons in the West. Not the steel, not the powder, but the story they left behind. Most of the men who carried weapons never wanted to use them. Not really. They knew what it meant, what it cost. You didn't just risk your life, you risked your future. Your name. One wrong pull and you weren't a ranch hand anymore. You were a killer. That kind of label didn't wash off easy, not even in a river full of whiskey. And yet, almost everyone was armed. It wasn't a choice, it was the weather. You didn't step outside without your boots, your hat, or your gun. Even preachers packed pistols under their robes, just in case the sermon didn't sit well with a drunk in the back row. There were no guarantees in the West, only precautions. Young guns were the worst. The eager ones. Boys barely old enough to shave, trying to act like they'd survived 10 shootouts. They practiced with bottles on fence posts, spun their pistols like circus performers, and begged older cowboys to teach them the fast draw. Most of them didn't last long. A loud mouth and a light trigger finger was a fast track to an early grave. Older cowboys watched them with quiet judgment. They'd seen how quickly bravado turned into blood. They'd seen friends go down for nothing. An argument over a card, a woman, a pair of stolen spurs. The lesson was always the same. If you reached for your weapon, you better have something worth dying for. Some ranchers enforced their own rules. No guns inside the bunkhouse. No knives at the dinner table. Not out of morality, just good business. Too many dead cowhands meant slow cattle drives and angry investors. But once you were out on the trail, it was different. Coyotes, rustlers, river crossings that could go from calm to chaos in minutes. Out there, a blade or a revolver wasn't a symbol, it was backup. And it wasn't just about people. Nature had teeth too. Snakes in your bedroll, cougars watching from the ridges. A storm rolling in could spook the herd and leave you trampled before you had time to shout. In those moments, you didn't worry about honor or showmanship. You worried about staying alive. Weapon maintenance became a ritual. Cleaning the barrel, oiling the trigger, checking the edge of your knife. It was like grooming a horse or mending your boots. A clean weapon was a ready one. A ready one meant you might see tomorrow. The frontier didn't allow many second chances. Some cowboys personalized their gear, carved initials into the handle, wrapped leather strips around the grip. A lucky coin nailed into the butt of the revolver. Not for style, for comfort. Something to remind them that they were still human in a land that often forgot. Because in the West, it was easy to become just another silhouette on the ridge. Just another name etched into a wooden cross. In the end, violence didn't define the cowboy, but it shadowed him. Every mile he rode, every town he passed through, every time his hand drifted to his belt when a door creaked open, it was always there, waiting, not as an enemy, but as a constant companion, like dust, like hunger, like the setting sun. And when a cowboy died, they said his pistol was buried with him, barrel down, just in case he needed it on the other side. Long after the guns were holstered and the cattle tied down, the fire became the center of everything. Cowboys didn't need much to spin a tale, just a flicker of flame, a half-full coffee tin, and someone willing to listen. And they always had listeners. The prairie was wide and dark, and voices filled the silence like smoke rising into the stars. Ghost stories were a favorite, not because cowboys believed them, at least not always, but because they reminded everyone that the world still had mystery. Even men who had seen lightning strike the same tree twice or had ridden out sandstorms so thick they could barely breathe. Even they paused when someone mentioned a spirit walking the canyon rim. Every crew had one storyteller. Might be the cook, might be the youngest hand trying to earn his place. But when the fire cracked and the moon rose, someone always leaned forward with that glint in their eye and said, "Y'all ever hear about the ranch that buried itself?" And just like that, the night belonged to the strange. Some stories were old, handed down from Mexican vaqueros, native trackers, or trappers who lived half-wild up in the hills. They talked about ghost herds, whole droves of cattle you could hear thundering through the gulch, though the ground stayed still. Others swore they'd seen a rider with no shadow, drifting silent under the moon, never leaving tracks. And no one who followed him ever came back the same. The prairie itself seemed to play tricks. Lights would dance out on the flatlands where no fire should be. Coyotes howled in unison, too perfectly timed to be natural. Some men said they heard voices in the wind, calling their name from far off, always just behind them, never ahead. And when they turned around, there was nothing but tall grass and the ache of being watched. Not every story ended in terror. Some were just strange. A man who found a silver dollar in a dried-up creek every morning, like the riverbed remembered being rich. A ghost dog that herded cattle better than any living mutt, then vanished into the dawn mist. Or the old prospector who claimed his pickaxe could find water if you whispered to it in Spanish. Cowboys didn't need these tales to be true. They just needed them to be told. Out on the trail, stories were more than entertainment. They were protection, not from bullets, but from boredom, from loneliness, from the creeping feeling that maybe the world was just endless sky and dust. A good ghost story gave shape to the dark. It made the night feel alive, like it was listening too. Some men brought journals, scribbled strange things they'd heard in old mining towns or from a woman in a border cantina. They'd read them aloud like scripture, each tale more twisted than the last. And every so often, the youngest rider would swear he saw something moving in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the firelight. Everyone laughed, but no one offered to check. Even the skeptics played along. said things like, "That's just wind," or "You drank too much cactus gin." But their eyes darted to the darkness, just like the rest. No one ever truly felt alone out there. Something always felt near, watching, waiting. Maybe that's what made the stories stick. Not that they were scary, but that they fit. The West was already full of the impossible. Why not a ghost bride in the desert? Why not a coyote that whispered warnings? After all, when you ride through a land where the sky stretches forever and the horizon never blinks, anything can feel real, especially the things that shouldn't. They didn't call it superstition, not out loud. Cowboys used words like caution or old habits, but everyone had their little rituals. A coin in the left boot, never lighting 3 cigarettes from the same match, tipping the hat to the moon. It wasn't about belief, it was about balance. The West didn't reward arrogance. It reminded you over and over that you were small, and maybe, just maybe, not alone out there. One of the oldest stories was about the whistling man. No one remembered where it started. Maybe New Mexico, maybe Kansas, but everyone seemed to know the tune, high, off-key, slow like molasses. He only came at night, they said, when the stars were sharp and the prairie wind too still. If you heard his whistle behind you, you kept walking. Never turn, never answer. Just keep your boots steady and your eyes ahead. The men who turned, well, no one really said what happened, just that they didn't come back right. Another tale followed cattle drives up from Texas, the firewoman of the Cimarron Trail. She burned red-orange like a lantern, always seen at a distance, standing motionless near dry creeks or in the gaps between hills. If you rode toward her, she vanished. If you ignored her, she followed. One hand raised, no face. Cowboys said she was looking for her husband, lost in the war. Others claimed she was the war itself, never buried proper. Either way, no one camped where she'd been seen. The cattle wouldn't settle, and the horses went white-eyed with fear. Even the animals seemed to sense things. Dogs howled at empty corners of the bunkhouse. Horses refused to cross certain river bends. One trail boss claimed his whole herd turned back on their own, stampeding away from a stretch of flatland where no grass grew. He found a circle there, perfect, scorched, silent. No insects, no breeze, just stillness. He rerouted the entire drive, lost 5 days, and never regretted it once. Around the campfire, these stories took on weight. They weren't just diversions. They became anchors, shared fears that turned into folklore. The quiet kid with too much imagination. He became the seer. The grizzled scout who barely spoke. Suddenly, he was the one who had seen something out past the butte. A shape, a shadow, something that breathed without lungs. It wasn't always fear. Sometimes it was wonder. A cowboy might swear he saw lights dancing above the canyon one night. Bright, flickering, moving like fireflies in a jar. He'd say he followed them, only to find his canteen refilled and his blisters gone. Another might talk about the ghost girl in the yellow dress who sang lullabies by the stream, keeping snakes away from the sleeping herd. No one asked too many questions. No one wanted to break the spell. Cowboys didn't have churches out there. No steeples, no pews. Their religion was the open sky, the taste of coffee at sunrise, and the quiet chill of knowing something bigger might be watching. Stories filled in the gaps, gave shape to the unknown, and whether those shapes came with wings, hooves, or hollow eyes, well, that was up to the teller. When a new hand joined the crew, they got tested. Not with hazing, with stories. If they laughed too hard, if they rolled their eyes, they'd find their boots tied together come morning, or worse, posted on night watch alone. But if they listened, really listened, they earned their place. Because out on the range, it wasn't about toughness. It was about respect. For the land, for the dead, for the things you couldn't explain. Every rider knew a place they'd never go back to, a ridge where birds never sang, a cave that breathed cold air even in summer, a dry well with a rope that never stopped swinging. They didn't talk about it, but they remembered. You could see it in the way their fingers twitched near the fire, in the way they stared a little too long at the dark. The stories were how they kept each other whole, wrapped fear in words, turned silence into sound, made sense of a land too wide to hold alone. Some stories followed specific towns, like curses that clung to the dust. Dodge City had the blue-eyed stranger, a man too clean, too polite, who always asked for water and vanished before finishing his drink. In Abilene, it was the crying child behind the church, always just out of sight, even though no one had used that chapel in 20 years. And over in Laramie, cowboys whispered about the two-headed coyote that only showed up on moonless nights, howling in harmony with itself. Trail towns bred tales like thunderstorms, fast, wild, and hard to ignore. They stuck to the wood of saloons and clung to the floorboards of boarding houses. The bartender might claim he didn't believe in any of it, but he kept extra salt near the register, just in case. And the hotel clerk who scoffed at ghost stories? He was the same man who refused to rent room 3 after sunset. Something about the mirror always fogging up from the inside. Even lawmen had their moments. One old sheriff from El Paso swore he arrested the same man 3 times in 3 different towns. Same face, same voice, same scar above his left eye. But every time, the fingerprints came back different. The 3rd time, the man simply vanished from the cell overnight. Door locked, key still in the sheriff's pocket. Of course, not all stories were meant to scare. Some were there to remind cowboys that not everything had to make sense. Like the gambler who played cards with a skeleton. He won, of course. That's how the story went. Took home a gold coin that never tarnished, and a new pair of boots that never wore out. Luck's luck, the man would say, even if it comes from the grave. Others were morality tales, twisted through time, like the gunslinger who shot a preacher, only to wake up mute the next morning. Couldn't speak a word for the rest of his life. Or the rancher who cheated his neighbors out of land, and then found his cattle refusing to graze, as if the earth itself had turned against him. The message was always there. Maybe not loud, but lingering. You could break a man's word, but you couldn't break the land's memory. And then there were the ones no one wanted to tell. The ones about lost riders found miles from their route. Faces pale, mouths stitched shut with twine. Or the ones who returned talking in tongues, carving circles into their saddles and refusing to sleep indoors ever again. Those stories weren't shared around the fire. They lived in glances, in silence, in the way a man gripped his coffee cup a little tighter when the coyotes started howling. The power of the stories wasn't in proof. It was in repetition. A tale told often enough grew teeth, picked up details, names, dates, warnings. The bones stayed the same, but the flesh changed. What mattered wasn't if it happened, but that everyone acted like it could. That was enough to make it real. Sometimes, after a long night of stories, the cowboys would fall quiet. Just for a minute. The wind would shift, the fire would pop, and no one would move. Not because they believed the whistling man was outside the circle, but because, just for a breath, they didn't want to find out. And in that stillness, something settled. A shared understanding that the West was too big for certainty, too wild for logic. It had its own rhythm, its own shadows, its own rules. And the best thing a man could do was listen. Really listen. Not just to the stories, but to the space between them. Because out there, the silence always had something to say. Every crew had a skeptic. The kind of fella who'd say, "That's horse spit," and roll his eyes so hard you'd think he sprained something. He'd call it wind, or coyotes or campfire tricks. But those same men never volunteered for the night shift after a strong story. They always found a reason to stay near the fire or accidentally fall asleep with the others. You could pretend not to believe, but the dark didn't care. The night changed things. In the daytime, everything felt sharp and logical. Trails were just trails, rocks were just rocks. But once the sun dipped and the coyotes started up, the west got softer at the edges. Things blurred. A tree stump looked like a hunched figure. A lone bird call sounded like a whisper. Cowboys who'd ridden through gunfire without blinking might suddenly jump at a rustle in the grass. That's where the stories lived, in that blur. They crawled into your thoughts when your eyes were tired and your coffee ran out. They filled up the space between the stars. And once they got in, they stayed. Some cowboys swore they dreamed about the figures they'd heard about. Not nightmares exactly, more like warnings. Signs. A glimpse of something they weren't meant to see. There was one tale that circled nearly every ranch. The Hollow Rider. Folks said he had no face, just a long duster and boots that didn't leave tracks. He rode in silence, horse hooves making no sound. He never spoke, never drew, never threatened. He'd just appear, standing at the edge of camp, watching. And if you saw him once, that was fine. Twice meant bad luck. 3 times? You were already done for. No one claimed to have seen him 3 times. But every cowboy knew someone who had. Firelight did strange things to people. It made faces dance, eyes glow, and shadows stretch long into the brush. It made even the most sensible man feel like he was sharing space with something older than time. And when the stories were good, really good, they didn't even need a monster. Just a strange noise, an unanswered question, a boot print where there shouldn't be one. A favorite game was trying to outcreep each other. One man would tell a tale about a haunted mine, collapsed, cursed, full of whispering voices. The next would raise him with a story about a poker game played with ghosts. No betting chips, just memories. You didn't win money, just years off your life. Everyone laughed, of course, but sometimes it came with a twitch, a glance toward the edge of the fire, just to make sure. Campfires were like confession booths. After the second cup of coffee or the third shot of rye, the hard men softened. They'd admit things, little things. Once heard a baby crying in the middle of nowhere. Swear I saw a woman walking through the desert barefoot. No tracks behind her. Horse wouldn't go forward. And I swear to God, something was standing in the way, but I couldn't see it. No one judged. No one scoffed. The code of the range wasn't just about cattle and chores, it was about listening. Letting men say what they needed to say. Because silence could be dangerous too. It built up like pressure. And stories, strange as they were, let some of that pressure out. Some said the stories came from the land itself. That the dust remembered things. That the rocks carried secrets. That the wind wasn't just wind. It was the voice of what came before. Old bones. Lost names. Forgotten wrongs. Cowboys didn't always say it out loud. But they felt it. You could ride for miles and still feel followed. Like something was pacing you just out of sight. The West was a wide place, but it wasn't empty. Not really. It was full of echoes, and some echoes walked on 2 legs. When the fire burned low and the stars started to hum their quiet song overhead, the stories took on a slower rhythm. Not because the men were tired, though they were, but because some tales couldn't be told too loud. They had to be eased into like a boot into worn leather. A whisper, not a declaration. Something that tiptoed into the dark rather than marched straight through it. The West had plenty of room for stories. It had the silence. It had the shadows. It had the aching kind of distance that made a man's mind wander to things he wouldn't normally say. And so, around those fires, after the coffee turned bitter and the jokes wore thin, the real stories came out. The ones that didn't need ghosts to be haunting. A man might tell you about the time he rode for days with a chill he couldn't shake, only to find out later he'd passed through land where a whole town had died of fever. Another might speak of waking up to hoofprints circling his bedroll. Just one horse, no rider. Or the trail cook who claimed he saw a boy sitting by the fire at dawn, barefoot and smiling, though no one had seen a child for miles. These weren't the loud stories. They didn't have gunfights or flames or monsters with glowing eyes. But they lingered. They sat on your shoulders, heavy and cool, long after the sun rose. And maybe that was the mark of a true ghost story out here. Not that it scared you, but that it stayed. Many cowboys believed you had to leave something behind when you crossed certain places. A stone, a button, even a few words muttered under your breath. They didn't call it superstition, just manners. A way of saying, I'm just passing through, because the land remembered things. The wind, the soil, the dry bones underfoot. They didn't forget. And if you weren't respectful, they might just remind you who was here first. There were stories of songs heard across valleys, harmonicas playing where no one was camped, laughter rising from old mines long abandoned, even whistling soft, wandering tunes that never repeated, never ended, the kind that followed you for a while, then disappeared the second you stopped to listen. Some men carried trinkets, little keepsakes, not for luck. Luck was unreliable, but for connection. A hand-carved charm from a dying vaquero, a scrap of red cloth tied to the saddlehorn. Things that reminded them they weren't alone, even when they were. And sometimes, when the prairie stretched too far and the silence pressed too close, that was enough to keep you sane. You didn't talk about fear directly, not out here, but it showed up in stories. The kind that hinted at things just outside the firelight. Shapes that moved like people but didn't breathe like them. Whispers that sounded too much like names. Or the old woman some claimed walked backward through the desert, covering her own tracks. And when morning came, no one mocked. No one dismissed it as nonsense. The stories were part of the work, like mending tack or stoking the coals. They bound the crew together, gave the darkness a shape, gave the unknown a name. And once named, it was a little easier to bear. Some tales were passed from rider to rider, growing in the telling. Others faded with the man who held them. But all of them left something behind, an image, a feeling, a warning. Cowboys didn't write them down. They didn't need to. The land kept the ledger. As the sun crept up and the last ember cracked, boots were pulled on, hats settled, horses saddled. Another day's ride ahead. But in the glances passed between men, in the slow blink of someone who hadn't quite slept, the stories remained. Waiting for night, for fire, for breath. Because out here, in the places maps forget, the stories were more than tales. They were company. Out on the range, before the sun even considered rising, cowboys were already moving. No alarm clocks, no soft awakenings, just the cold slap of dawn and the ache of another long day ahead. The work didn't wait, neither did the cattle. And if you were lucky, your boots were still dry from the day before. Hard work was the rule, not the exception. Most days started with a stiff cup of coffee. Boiled too long, poured too fast, strong enough to strip paint. Then came the saddling, the checking, the counting. Was the herd where it should be? Did anything spook them overnight? Any calves gone missing? Any fence lines down? Any fresh prints in the dirt? You learned to read the ground like scripture. One wrong sign and your day got a lot longer. The cattle drives were no parade. Dust in your teeth. Blisters in places you didn't know could blister. The saddle felt like home, except less comfortable. You rode for hours with nothing but the sound of hooves, flies, and the occasional grunt of a longhorn who didn't feel like cooperating. And when it rained, it wasn't a sprinkle. It was a sideways, punishing sheet of water that soaked you through, made the trail slick, and turned rivers into traps. But the real danger wasn't always the weather. It was the land itself. Prairie potholes deep enough to snap a horse's leg. Rattlesnakes curled up under your saddle blanket. Flash floods that came out of nowhere and swept men away before they could even holler. You learned fast to trust your gut, and even faster to trust your horse. Horses, after all, had better instincts. If they balked at crossing a stream or stepping into a grove, you listened. Cowboys joked that their horses were the smarter half of the partnership, and most weren't really joking. A good horse could save your life more than once. A bad one? Well, you'd only make that mistake once. The work wasn't glamorous. You weren't out there for the view, though some mornings made the sky look like a watercolor painting gone wild. You were out there because someone had to move beef from point A to point B, and the trains only went so far. The rest was up to rawhide, grit, and whatever strength you hadn't burned up yesterday. Meals were quick. Beans, jerky, maybe some biscuits if the cook felt generous. Water was gold, and the tin cup got passed around with little ceremony. Hygiene? Optional. Showers? Non-existent. You washed in rivers when you could, wiped off dust when you couldn't, and hoped nobody had a nose too sensitive. Nobody judged. Everyone stank. Sometimes a storm rolled in so fast you didn't have time to think. Just react. Tie down what you could, cover what mattered, and ride it out. Lightning could stampede the herd in seconds, turning a quiet evening into a nightmare of thundering hooves and chaos. Men got trampled, bones broke, and you still had to get up the next day and do it all again. The danger wasn't constant, but it was never far. And even on the calmest days, there was always the quiet threat of being alone out there. Miles from town, no backup, just you, your horse, and a 1,000-pound animal with its own ideas about where it should be. A wrong step, a fall, a bad twist. There were a dozen ways to end up stranded. That's why cowboys checked their gear twice, tied knots that held, and kept their rifles within reach. There was pride in it, though. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that lived in calloused hands and sun-cracked skin. That came from doing something hard, doing it well, and not needing to talk about it. The kind that said, I made it through another day, even if no one else saw it happen. Because out there, on the trail, the work didn't care who you were. It only cared if you could keep up. Evenings on the trail were strange things. Quiet, but never peaceful. You'd think after 12 hours in the saddle, a cowboy could finally breathe. But instead, the dark just brought different worries. The herd could spook at anything. A sudden noise, a distant wolf howl, even a strange smell in the wind. One wrong move, and thousands of pounds of muscle and horns could stampede into the night, crushing anything in their path, including you. So, cowboys took turns keeping watch. 2 men awake while the others slept. They called it riding the drag, and no one liked doing it. Your job was to circle the herd slow and steady, humming, talking, sometimes singing just loud enough for the cattle to know you were there. Silence made them nervous. Familiar voices kept them calm. That's why cowboys became singers, storytellers, murmurers of nonsense. Whatever it took to stop a disaster. It was lonely work, out there under the stars. Your voice the only thing between calm and chaos. Some nights you'd talk just to hear something other than hoofbeats and wind. Others, you'd swear you heard something answer. Maybe just an echo, maybe the coyotes. But it always made the hairs on your neck twitch. Storms were the worst. When the sky split open like an angry god and rain fell sideways, there wasn't much you could do except grit your teeth and ride. Lightning lit up the plains like day. Horses reared, cattle moaned, and the whole world felt like it might come apart at the seams. You could smell the ozone before the strike, feel the pressure drop in your gut. And when it hit close, close enough to see the flash and feel your bones hum. You held on and hoped it wasn't your turn. Floods were quieter, but no less deadly. A dry creek bed could turn into a roaring river in minutes. Campsites vanished. Tents, wagons, food gone. More than one cowboy drowned just trying to save the coffee pot. You learned to read the clouds. You learned to pitch camp higher even if it meant a longer walk. And you learned that nature didn't negotiate. Snakes didn't care about your plans either. They curled under bedrolls, slithered into boots, even dropped from trees. Most weren't looking for trouble, but if you stepped wrong, that rattle was the last sound you wanted to hear. Some cowboys carried snakebite kits. Most just carried knives and a grim understanding of what might happen if the venom spread too fast. There were other dangers, too, the kind that didn't come with fangs or thunder, like getting thrown from your horse in the middle of nowhere. One busted leg and you might be stuck for days. Or a simple infection from a blister or a bad tooth. There weren't doctors out there, just whiskey and stitching needles. And not always both. Still, they did it, day after day. Not for riches, most got paid little and late. Not for glory. No one cheered a man for fixing a broken axle or saving a panicked steer. They did it because it was the work. Because something about waking up to a horizon you couldn't see the end of made everything feel honest. Hard, but honest. At night, when the fire was lit and the coffee finally hot, the men would talk about the worst days like old friends. Remember that storm outside Amarillo? That steer that nearly took my leg off? That bridge we almost lost the whole herd on? They laughed about it. Partly because it was behind them, and partly because laughing was easier than remembering what could have gone wrong. Out there, toughness wasn't loud. It was quiet, persistent, the kind that kept going, even with torn boots and empty bellies. The kind that didn't ask for praise, just a place to sit and a meal that wasn't burnt. The kind that looked up at a sky full of stars and thought, "All right, let's do it again tomorrow." There were stretches of trail so empty, so wide, they felt like another planet. No trees, no buildings, just endless land and a sky so big it made your thoughts feel small. Cowboys rode through it in silence, not because they didn't have anything to say, but because there was something about the space that swallowed up words. You could ride for hours without seeing a soul, just your own shadow trailing behind you, long and wavering, like it was trying to outrun you. Solitude wasn't just a fact, it was a test. Days alone on the prairie messed with your head. You'd start talking to your horse, to the wind, to yourself. Sometimes just to hear a voice. Sometimes because it felt like something out there was listening. The land had a way of stretching time. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. You could swear you passed the same rock twice. Or that the sun wasn't moving at all. Men lost track of more than just direction. They lost track of TH, but the work didn't stop just because the world felt strange. You had cows to find, water to chase, fences to patch. Some days, your only company was the sound of a hawk overhead or the buzz of flies near your saddlebag. And yet, in that quiet, cowboys found something a little like peace. A hard peace, sure, but real. No one was judging you out there. No one expected small talk. You just had to keep moving and not fall apart. The heat could melt your thoughts if you weren't careful. Hats helped, but only so much. Your shirt would soak through by noon and dry again by 2. The dust worked its way into your teeth, your eyes, your boots. Some cowboys wrapped scarves over their faces, not for style, but survival. Breathing dirt all day made your lungs feel like sandpaper. And when the wind kicked up, it was like being sandblasted by the earth itself. Water was everything. You measured your day in canteen sips and creek crossings. You learned to spot green on the horizon like a hawk spots a mouse. Horses knew where water was too, and sometimes you had to trust their nose more than your map. And when you did find a stream, you drank slow, soaked your bandana, maybe even dunked your head. But you didn't linger. There was always more ground to cover. Injury was never far away. A twisted ankle, a cracked rib. Even a stubbed toe could turn nasty if it got infected. Blisters turned into open sores. A broken finger could mean losing your grip on the reins at the worst moment. And out there, no one was coming to help. If you got hurt, you got up. If you couldn't get up, well, that was the end of it. Still, cowboys had a way of helping each other without making a fuss. If someone limped, the others slowed down. If someone's horse went lame, someone offered a mule. No big speeches. No thanks expected. The West didn't have room for selfishness. You either worked together or you didn't last. Evenings were better. Not easier, just softer. The heat let go. The sky turned lavender. And the kind of tired that settled in your bones made food taste better and silence feel earned. You might clean your saddle, write a few lines in a weather-beaten journal, or just stare at the fire until your eyes forgot how to blink. Sometimes you'd think about home if you had one, a town you hadn't seen in years, a name you hadn't spoken in longer. But mostly you thought about tomorrow, the miles ahead, the trail that never really ended, and the work that would be waiting when the sun came up again. Because out there, in that vast and stubborn land, every day was a small survival. And surviving felt like a kind of victory. There were days when the horizon never seemed to move. You'd ride and ride, hour after hour, and yet the same hills sat stubborn in the distance, like they were daring you to reach them. The land didn't care about your destination. It didn't care that your hands were blistered, your lips cracked, or that your horse was running out of steam. The land was old and patient. It had buried stronger men than you. Most cowboys learned early on that complaining didn't help. You kept your head down and did the job. Maybe you muttered a few choice words under your breath when your saddle rubbed raw or your rope snapped mid-throw. But you didn't dwell on it. Dwelling made time drag. It made aches louder. And when you were out there alone or nearly alone, you couldn't afford to sink too deep into your own misery. Sometimes the only way to keep going was to make a rhythm out of the work. The steady creak of leather, the jingle of the bit, the quiet scuff of hooves in the dirt. You'd lose yourself in it like a metronome for survival. If the wind was right, you might hum a tune, something your mother sang, or something you heard once in a saloon and never forgot. Music didn't make the work easier, but it made it feel like something other than punishment. It wasn't all struggle. There were moments, brief, bright ones, when the world opened up and reminded you why you stayed. A herd moving in perfect unison. A hawk diving so clean it didn't seem real. A sunrise that painted the ground gold and the sky purple, like some painter had gone and lost his mind with the brush. You didn't stop for long, but you noticed. You let it fill your lungs before moving on. Then came the days when nothing went right, the kind where cattle scattered at the worst possible time, or a rope slipped and you ended up face first in the mud, or your horse spooked and dragged you a few feet before you managed to grab hold. The kind of day that made you question every choice that brought you here. But still, you didn't quit. You got up. You cursed. You fixed the mess best you could. Being a cowboy wasn't about being invincible. It was about getting back on the horse, literally and otherwise, after it threw you. About showing up even when the trail was rough, the air was dry, and your back felt like it had been kicked by a mule. You weren't out there for praise. There was no applause, no audience. Just the job and the hope that you could sleep without too many rocks under your bedroll. The worst nights were the ones when the cold crept in early, when the fire didn't catch and your blanket felt too thin, when the wind cut through your coat and howled like a warning. You'd curl up near your horse for warmth, one eye open, ears tuned to every sound. You didn't scare easy, but you respected the dark. You knew what could happen when a man got careless. Some nights, a storm would pass miles off, but you'd still feel it. The air heavy, the clouds bruised and churning. You'd tie everything down tighter and hope the weather held. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. There wasn't much room for planning, just reacting. The range was like that, never cruel for cruelty's sake, just indifferent. You adapted or you left. At the end of the day, when the fire finally caught and the beans started to bubble, you'd sit quiet with the others. No need to talk much. The work had already spoken for everyone. Maybe someone would mention tomorrow's route or who was taking the early watch. Maybe someone would pass a flask. But mostly, there was just the sound of chewing, of boots shifting in the dirt, of flames licking the pot. And if you were lucky, maybe, just maybe, you'd sleep through the night without a single alarm. No stampede, no snake, no storm, just stars above, the faint warmth of the fire, and the knowledge that for one more day you made it. Most cowboys didn't talk about the danger. They just lived with it like dust in their clothes or sunburn on their neck. It was part of the deal, unspoken, ever present. You could die from a broken stirrup or a horn to the ribs. You could vanish in a flood, in a canyon, in a fevered dream alone in the brush. But you didn't dwell on it. Thinking too long on death made your hands slow and your eyes jumpy. Still, every crew had stories. The hand who fell asleep on watch and never woke up. The one who got dragged a mile after a spooked mount took off. Or the old-timer who rode into a gulch and never came back. They didn't always talk about it around the fire. Sometimes it came up in a quiet moment, a name spoken into the smoke, a pause before passing the flask. A story told not for drama, but for memory. There was danger in the land, yes, but there was also danger in the men. Tempers flared fast when the days were long and the bellies half empty. A small slight could become a fistfight. A joke could turn sharp. And when knives or pistols were close at hand, things could turn bad in a blink. That's why good trail bosses watched the crew close, kept a lid on things, knew when to separate a pair before trouble started to simmer. But even the meanest cowhand would throw his coat over a hurt horse or share water on a dry run. Because when the land pressed down, you needed each other. Didn't matter where you were from, what you believed, or how many teeth you had left. Out there, survival was a team effort, even when the team didn't like each other all that much. Loneliness was its own kind of danger. You'd see it in the eyes of the rider who rode a little too far from camp, spoke a little too slow, started mumbling to the wind. The prairie was beautiful, but it didn't hug back. And a man alone for too long started to feel it, like a weight in the chest or a hole behind the ribs. That's when the stories helped. Even the silly ones. Even the ghost tales. Something to remind you that you weren't invisible. And when a cowboy did go down, the crew didn't make a fuss. They buried him fast, proper, and quiet. A few words. A rock pile. Sometimes a name carved into a post. Sometimes just a boot nailed to a fence post so folks passing by would nod and know. Not all goodbyes were loud. Some were just necessary. Despite it all, the blisters, the burns, the broken bones. Most of them wouldn't trade it. There was a strange kind of freedom in the hardship. A way the work stripped you down and showed you what was left underneath. Some men didn't like what they found. Others held onto it like a badge. The real danger, they'd say, wasn't the storm or the snake. It was the day you stopped noticing the sky. The day you stopped caring if your horse was limping or if the fire was burning low. That's when the land had you. When you weren't riding it anymore, it was riding you. So they stayed sharp, paid attention, looked out for each other, even when they pretended not to. Because for all its cruelty, the West rewarded the watchful. The prepared, the ones who knew how to mend leather and clean a rifle and spot trouble 2 ridges away. And when the day was done, the herd was calm, and the stars came back out like old friends. There was peace. Not safety, never safety, but peace, in the rhythm of breath and boot steps and embers in the fire. Hard work, real danger, and somehow still worth it. You could tell a lot about a cowboy by the way he treated his horse. Didn't matter if his boots were polished or if he could shoot straight. If he jerked the reins too hard or cursed at a tired mount, folks took note. A good horse wasn't just transportation. It was a partner, a lifeline, sometimes the only thing between you and the long, lonesome nothing. Most cowboys didn't name their horses for fun. They did it for connection. Buck, Whiskey, Luna, Dusty, names that rolled off the tongue like old friends. And they weren't just for show. A cowboy talked to his horse like he'd talk to a bunkmate. Soft when needed, sharp when things got serious. The bond was more than rope and saddle. It was built over miles, storms, and close calls. Some horses had a sixth sense. They'd stiffen before a snake crossed the trail, or dig in their hooves before a bridge gave out. A good horse didn't spook easy, didn't bolt at gunfire, and didn't mind sleeping under the stars. In return, cowboys brushed them down even when their own shirts were crusted in dust. They checked hooves before their own boots, shared water, took the bad weather up front so the horse could rest under a tarp. It wasn't just horses. Dogs had their place too. Tough little things, scrappy, loyal, sometimes half-wild. They kept snakes out of bedrolls and strangers off the trail. Some herded better than hired hands. Others just offered company, curling up by the fire with a sigh that said, "We made it another day." No one expected them to work, but they always did. There were trail tales of dogs that followed a crew for weeks with no name, no collar, just showed up one morning and stayed. Others had been born along the trail, raised on beans and boot scraps, and never knew anything but dust and hooves. And when they died, quietly, without complaint, someone would bury them under a mesquite tree or mark the spot with stones. No ceremony, just respect. Sometimes the bond went further. A cowboy might befriend a prairie dog that visited camp every morning for crumbs, or a coyote that kept its distance but always circled the herd at night, never threatening, just there. One fella swore a raven followed him across 3 states, calling out every time he tried to sleep in past dawn. Superstition? Maybe, but out there patterns mattered. Some cowboys swore animals understood more than people did. You could talk to your horse about things you'd never say to another man. Fears, dreams, the kind of thoughts that surfaced when the stars were too bright and the night too quiet. The horse never judged, just flicked its ear or shifted its weight, like it heard and agreed. Yeah, it's a hard world. The bond ran so deep that when a cowboy lost his horse, it hurt more than most would admit. There were stories of men walking for miles beside an empty saddle, of old hands retiring after the animal that carried them for 15 years finally laid down and didn't get up. In towns, it wasn't uncommon to see a man drinking alone, hat pulled low, and just know that he'd buried more than a beast that day. And still, despite the heartbreak, they kept forming those bonds. Because the trail was long, the land was hard, and no one made it through alone. Every cowboy had a story about a horse that wasn't just good, it was right. The kind that met your eyes and somehow understood what needed doing without being told. The kind that didn't flinch at thunder or gunfire, that pulled hard when the trail turned to mud, and stood calm when everything else was losing its mind. You didn't ride those horses, you traveled with them, like 2 halves of one mind. There was one they called Smoke, a gray gelding with a crooked ear and a stride like a whisper. Nobody wanted him at first. He spooked easy as a colt, didn't trust anyone. But one rider stuck it out, gave him time, rode him slow, never forced the bit. And one day, out on the high pass during a hailstorm, Smoke stayed steady while every other horse bucked or bolted. That was the day the crew stopped calling him a problem and started calling him legend. Good horses earned names that stuck, not just for their color or their speed, but for what they meant. Widowmaker, Dust Devil, Moonshine. Some names carried warnings, others carried pride. And when you heard a name passed around from one ranch to another, you knew you were hearing about more than muscle. You were hearing about trust. But animals weren't just tools. They were quiet companions in a loud world. When the work was done and the fire burned low, a cowboy might lean back against his saddle, boots kicked out, and reach over to scratch behind a dog's ear. No words needed, just that soft click of bone on hide. That kind of peace didn't come from people. Cats had their place too, especially on ranches, tough little mousers that kept barns clean and food stores safe. They weren't cuddly, and they sure didn't fetch, but they had a way of knowing when you needed company. You'd find them curled up on your shirt or stalking shadows while you cleaned your rifle. They didn't need you, but somehow they always showed up when it mattered. Then there were the strange ones. Coyotes raised from pups, riding in wagons like overgrown dogs. Hawks that stayed close, circling overhead like sentries. Even a half-blind mule deer that followed one old cowboy around like a dog, gentle as could be. No one could explain it. They just shrugged and said, "He's got a way with creatures." And maybe he did. Kids on the frontier learned early to respect animals. Not fear them, but watch them. A snake didn't bite unless you gave it reason. A horse didn't buck unless you earned it. And a dog that growled was probably warning you about something you hadn't seen yet. Lessons came fast and sometimes hard, but once you learned, you never forgot. The bond ran both ways. Cowboys didn't just expect loyalty, they returned it. They shared their last biscuit, poured the clean water into a dog bowl before taking a sip, stood guard over a shivering colt in the rain, even if it meant getting soaked to the bone themselves. Out there, kindness wasn't weakness. It was survival. Death came for animals same as men. Snakes, storms, sickness, or just old age under the open sky. And when it did, there weren't speeches. Just a moment, a hand on the shoulder, a shallow grave marked with a stone or a bit of tack, and maybe a note in a journal, "Lost bramble today. Damn good dog." Because a cowboy didn't just remember the names of people. He remembered the animals that kept him company when the nights were long and the road had no end. Not every animal on the frontier had a job. Some just showed up and stayed. They weren't herders or mousers or pack beasts. They were just there. Tag-alongs, ghosts with fur. Cowboys didn't mind. A camp felt less empty when something else was breathing nearby, even if it didn't say a word. There was a pig, once, that wandered into a camp near Santa Fe. Nobody claimed it and nobody chased it off. It didn't beg for scraps, didn't cause trouble. Just trotted from bedroll to bedroll, sniffing boots and grunting now and then. They named it Sheriff. Rode with them for almost 2 months. Then one day it was gone. No tracks, no noise, just gone. They talked about that pig for years. Nobody ever laughed when they did. Sometimes the connection between man and animal was so strong, it bent the rules of logic. One rider swore his horse found him after they got separated in a canyon. 3 days apart, 30 miles between them. The horse walked into camp like nothing had happened, covered in dust, ribs showing, but calm as a Sunday. No one could explain it. They just nodded and passed him the last of the beans. Dogs especially had a way of finding the people who needed them most. Strays would appear when spirits were low, sit beside you like they'd been waiting their whole life just to listen. They didn't care what you'd done or where you'd been. They cared that you were there, and they stayed until you could stand on your own again. Cowboys didn't write poems or paint portraits, but they carved initials into saddles. They kept old collars in their bedrolls long after the dog was gone. Some even tied tufts of horse mane into their hatbands, like luck or memory or both. You wouldn't call it sentimental, not out loud. But it mattered. There was a story about a cattle drive down near the Pecos. One of the riders got sick real bad. Fever dreams, shaking, couldn't ride. They were too far out to turn back. They left him with his dog, a little mutt called Whiskey. Said they'd come back with help. Took 4 days. When they got there, the rider was weak but alive, and the dog hadn't moved. Sat by him the whole time, chasing off buzzards, growling at the wind. Didn't eat, didn't sleep, just stayed. They say Whiskey got steak that night, and a blanket, and a permanent place on the payroll. The prairie itself had its own kind of animal life, things not tamed, not touched, but still part of the rhythm. Antelope that moved like smoke, owls that blinked at you from fence posts, prairie dogs chirping warnings from dusty mounds. They weren't pets, they weren't allies, but they were neighbors, and like any good neighbor, they deserved respect. A cowboy learned quick that animals noticed things before people did. When a dog growled at the dark, you looked twice. When your horse got jittery, you tightened your grip. When the coyotes went silent, you built up the fire and kept your hand near your rifle. The world had its own ways of warning you, if you were smart enough to listen. The older cowhands said animals could sense intention. Said a dog knew the difference between a man who was mean and one who was just tired. Said a horse could feel your mood through the reins. That might have been nonsense, or it might have been the truest thing ever spoken on the trail. You didn't have to believe it, but if you stayed long enough in the saddle, you started noticing it too. And maybe that was the whole point. Out there, where the sky went on forever and the days bled into each other, connection was rare. You took it where you could. A soft nicker, a tail thump, a warm shape by your boots when the night got cold. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between a man and the dark was something small, loyal, and covered in fur. Ranch animals weren't always useful in the traditional sense, but they filled roles no human could. A rooster might crow too late or not at all, but his sound meant morning had arrived. A barn cat chasing shadows at dusk told you the day was done. Even the lowing of cattle became a sort of song, steady, familiar, grounding. The rhythm of animals gave the frontier a pulse. Sometimes a cowboy would pick up a companion by accident. A calf born too small to keep up with the herd might get tucked into a bedroll and bottle-fed until it could stand. That kind of start bonded a man and beast in ways few understood. The calf might follow him for weeks, sometimes months, long after it was strong enough to go on its own. And when it finally did wander off into the larger herd, something stayed. A glance, a recognition, a shared memory of warmth on a cold night. One rider raised a jackrabbit, found it injured under a mesquite bush and kept it in a crate until the leg healed. Let it go once it could hop clean. That rabbit came back every morning for a week, just to sit and watch the camp. No tricks, no show. Just company. Cowboys didn't make a fuss, but they noticed. And when the rabbit stopped coming, the rider left a carrot where the crate had been, just in case. Even wild animals became part of the crew in their own strange way. Vultures that circled the same trail every week, as if they were scouts. A red fox that watched from the ridge each night as dinner cooked. You learned to respect the watchers, gave them space, nodded as if to say, "We see you too." Cowboys didn't waste much time trying to tame what didn't want taming. But they knew that if an animal chose to stick around, it meant something. That's why they didn't chase off strays. Why they left scraps by the edge of camp. Why they talked to creatures that couldn't answer. Not because they expected a reply, but because the silence felt kinder when shared. Kids growing up on ranches often formed their first friendships with animals. A half-blind goat, a chicken that followed them everywhere, a patient old dog who let them climb on his back and pretend he was a buffalo. These bonds ran deep, And when the animal passed, the grief was real. You might not cry when a man died, but when that old mutt didn't come back for breakfast, the whole bunkhouse went quiet. Horses carried the most weight, literally and otherwise. They remembered trails, sensed danger, and had a kind of judgment you couldn't teach. A good horse wouldn't step off a cliff or into a rattlesnake's nest, no matter how hard you kicked. And when you tied your reins to a fence post, you trusted it with your life. That kind of trust wasn't given lightly. It was earned day by day, mile by mile. And when a horse died, it left a hole no boots could fill. Cowboys buried them with honor. Sometimes in the pasture, sometimes on a hill with a view. They didn't mark the graves fancy, just a cross of sticks or a loop of rope. But every rider who passed knew what it meant. And if they had a hat on, they tipped it. Out on the range, animals didn't just help with the work. They made the work bearable. They reminded you that life wasn't all grit and grit's leftovers. That softness still had a place, even in the hardest men. That a wagging tail or a soft nicker could cut through the ache of sore muscles and missing home. In a world built on motion and dust, the presence of an animal offered stillness, connection, proof that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, no one had to be entirely alone. There was a belief, quiet but widespread, that a cowboy's soul didn't ride off alone when his time came. They said a good horse would sense it, said a dog might howl low and long, even from miles away. Maybe it was just legend. Maybe it was the truth wearing a little dust and superstition. Either way, no one laughed when a horse refused to eat or a mutt sat staring at the horizon too long. They just waited, and usually news arrived soon after. In the final miles of a cowboy's life, when the trail was shorter than it used to be, those animals became even more important. Less as tools, more as reminders. They had seen it all. The busted fences, the broken ribs, the long days that ended in blood and the rare ones that ended in music. And they never once turned away. Some old-timers were buried with pieces of tack, bridles, bits, worn-out reins. Not for ceremony, but because those were the things they touched most in life. More familiar than any Bible, more meaningful than any medal. And when their horses outlived them, those animals were often retired. Not sold, not ridden again, just allowed to be, to roam the ranch where their rider once lived, to grow old without pressure or purpose. A silent kind of mourning. The bond between man and beast in the Old West wasn't always tender. Could be rough, impatient, and loud. But beneath all that was care. A kind of mutual understanding forged in sun and dirt and necessity. You didn't pamper your horse, but you didn't let him suffer either. You didn't train your dog with treats, but you fed him better than yourself if the day had been hard enough. And sometimes the animals taught the cowboys more than the other way around. Taught them to wait, to trust, to rest when the sun was high and to move when the wind changed. Animals didn't overthink. They didn't hold grudges or plan revenge. They just were, present, grounded, in a way most men could only hope to be. It's no wonder some cowboys felt closer to their animals than to other people. A horse didn't gossip. A dog didn't lie. A cat didn't care if you hadn't bathed in a week. These creatures accepted what they were given, gave what they could, and asked for little in return. And in a world that demanded so much from its people, that kind of relationship was gold. Even cowboys who'd never admit to missing anyone would stop and kneel when an old dog limped by. They'd rub the graying fur and say something soft, something only that dog needed to hear. "You're all right, old boy. You still got it. We ain't done yet." In many ways, those animals were more than pets. They were memory keepers, the last to see a man at his worst, and sometimes the only ones to see him at his best. They were there when the herd stampeded, when the river flooded, when the fire wouldn't light. And they were there when the quiet finally came, When the trail ended, a cowboy didn't ask for much at the end. Just a little sky, a warm breeze, and maybe the weight of a tired dog resting at his feet. If he had that, he had everything. Because in a land where life was hard and death was certain, companionship, honest, wordless, and unwavering, was the purest kind of comfort. And so the cowboy rode, never quite alone, with hooves beside him, paws behind him, wings above him, trusted companions in a wild world, helping him carry the silence.